It is Sunday the 16th of June 2019. I'm standing in front of the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist congregation in Lachine, Quebec. It's the second of two Unitarian Universalist churches on the island of Montreal, the other one being the Unitarian Church of Montreal. And there's one other Unitarian Universalist church in Quebec out in eastern townships. But I am protesting here today because for the time being it's not possible for me to protest in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal as a result of the Unitarian Universalist perversion of justice. Specifically, the false criminal harassment accusation that Montreal Unitarian clergy abuse cover-up enabler Sue Montgomery had me arrested on when I came to the December 2017 City Council meeting to ask a question. And yes, that question would have been about Sue Montgomery's complicity in Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse cover-up efforts in the past, including her own knowing and willful participation in what I consider to be a Unitarian Universalist perversion of justice, which consisted of Sue Montgomery and a bunch of other Montreal Unitarians colluding with the new minister of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, Reverend Diane Rollert, to claim to fear for their personal safety so they could get a restraining order against me, which would prevent me from protesting against clergy abuse outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal. So essentially what it comes down to is that Sue Montgomery, various other Montreal Unitarians, about 10 or so, along with Reverend Diane Rollert, all signed depositions to the police claiming to fear for their personal safety. Some of the depositions contained what I consider to be paranoid fantasies or outright lies. One Unitarian, who by the way I think is now a member of this church, Sean Doring, he wrote a deposition to the police claiming that I was going to come and shoot everyone, basically do a mass killing at the Unitarian Church of Montreal, and this was imminent. This was going to happen like any day, like they're really desperate. We need to shut this guy down, as if a restraining order is actually going to stop someone from doing that kind of thing if that's what they want to do. In fact, trying to obtain a restraining order or a peace bond or whatever against that kind of person often actually provokes the opposite reaction. They actually go and do the mass shooting sooner rather than later because they're afraid they may not get the chance to do it later in terms of police shutting them down and so on. So it's just an incredibly stupid and foolish thing for Sean Doring to do, whether he's telling the truth or not. It's possibly actually suffers from paranoid delusions that I was going to come into the church and shoot everyone. Or he might have just been lying, he might have been lying, expedient lie, we need to convince the police that Rob and Edgar's dangerous, or at least that we fear for our safety so we can get a restraining order against them. And of course it was all about shutting down my protest in front of the church. They just didn't want to see me standing there with signs like this one. Actually, I'm not sure if this sign existed at that time. That was like 2007 when I believe the depositions were first made and the arrest was made. But Unitarian Universalists have been perverting justice from the very beginning of my conflict with them. They've perverted justice within the church itself. And not just in terms of me, by the way. Numerous victims of Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse, whether it's sexual abuse or non-sexual abuse, such as verbal abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, basically people being scammed financially by Unitarian Universalist ministers. Yes, that does happen. All of these things are very often not handled in a manner that lives up to the Unitarian Universalist religion's second principle, which calls for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. No, as in many other religious communities, the church, the institution, does everything it can to protect the minister and dismisses complaints, rejects complaints, and even bullies and harasses and intimidates the complainants. It's very rare you will see the Unitarian Church bullying and harassing and intimidating abusive Unitarian Universalist clergy, but they do in fact bully and intimidate and harass people who complain about clergy abuse. Perversion of justice. So anyway, getting back to the most recent perversion of justice by Montreal Unitarians, specifically Sue Montgomery's false accusation of criminal harassment, which sought to shut down my protest in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. It was all about placing conditions on me which would prevent me from protesting against clergy abuse outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal. That was not the only consideration. It might have even been a secondary one. The main thing Sue Montgomery wanted to do was to shut me out of city council meetings so I could not ask her questions about her complicity in Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse cover-up, and more specifically, questions about her past involvement in abusive misuse of the SPVM police force and the Canadian criminal justice system to shut down my legitimate, peaceful public protest against Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal. To make things relatively brief, looks like somebody's showing up here. To make things relatively brief, the restraining order was in fact granted by one of the worst judges in Quebec. I don't mind naming her. It was Roland Matt, a political appointee. I believe she was the wife of a high-ranking Liberal Party politician, even a former premier of Quebec. I won't name him, but if you do some research on Roland Matt, I think you'll discover that she's basically appointed as a judge through political cronyism. She was one of the most incompetent judges in Quebec. She was also a hard-nosed judge who, liked to find people guilty when they weren't. And that's essentially what she did. I mean, this was not a criminal charge against me. The level of proof was much lower. They didn't have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that they had fear for their safety. They only basically had to claim to fear for their safety, and I basically had to prove, if I could, that they had no reasonable grounds for their fear. And that's what I tried to do through trying to cross-examine Reverend Diane Rollett, who was the only witness. I wanted to show that she didn't actually have any reasonable grounds for her fear. If she actually had any fear, she could have been lying, like I'm sure some of the members of the Unitarian Church of Montreal were. Watch your steps there. You don't want to run into that. So anyway, what happened is essentially this was all done under the auspices of Reverend Diane Olenek Rollert. In other words, she was the only complainant in terms of the restraining order. All of the other people who signed depositions, they were in the background. They weren't witnesses in the hearings and so on. It wasn't possible to cross-examine them. It was only Reverend Diane Rollert. Every time I tried to cross-examine Reverend Diane Rollert about her claimed fear for her personal safety in an effort to show that A, she had no reasonable grounds for her fear, and B, might not have actual fear at all, but might have been lying, Judge Roland Matt prevented me from cross-examining her. So there was basically, she took everything Reverend Diane Rollert said at face value as if it was true, as if she actually had fear and she had reasonable grounds for fear and so on. And so she granted the peace order, restraining order, whatever you want to call it. It's known as Nate 10 in legal jargon, which shut down my protest in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal for 1 year. And I will add that one thing that was very interesting about this peace order is that it did not contain Reverend Diane Rollert's residence in it. It was only the church. If Reverend Diane Rollert genuinely feared for her safety, genuinely feared that I was going to physically attack her, then why wasn't the restraining order applied to her residence? It's very, very obvious that the real reason for this restraining order, the real reason for Reverend Diane Rollert and Sue Montgomery and Sean Doring and a bunch of other Montreal Unitarians to claim to fear for their personal safety in deposition to the police was to get the restraining order to prevent me from protesting in front of the church. If all of these other people feared for their safety, why weren't their residences also protected and so on? It's total bullshit, quite frankly. Some of them might have had, irrational fears, because I'm actually very peaceful, the long history of non-violence. Even in 2007, I had been protesting for almost a decade, and in that time period, nobody had received so much as a scratch from me. I'd never threatened anyone and so on. So it's basically an abusive misuse of the SPVM police force and the criminal justice system to shut down my peaceful public protest in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. And Sue Montgomery, the justice reporter for the Gazette at the time, was a direct participant in that in terms of signing her own deposition to the police claiming to be afraid of me. Now here's the interesting thing. Sue Montgomery was in fact the Gazette's justice reporter and had been for some time in 2007, I believe. She'd already been the justice reporter for at least 2 or 3 years. So she knew the court system. She knew judges, she knew Crown prosecutors, she knew lawyers, she probably knew various cops and so on. So here's the interesting thing. I have been told by people who are in a position to know certain things that Sue Montgomery basically was quite instrumental in that process of seeking a restraining order against me. I'm not going to say that there was any behind-the-scenes influence in terms of judges and the Crown prosecutors and the police and so on, although it's possible that there was, but it does appear, from what I've been told by people who they're in a position to know certain facts, that Sue Montgomery was almost certainly the person who came up with the idea of having Reverend Diane Roller seek a restraining order against me on the basis of claiming a fear for her personal safety. So I can't prove it beyond reasonable doubt, but I've basically been told by people who usually know what they're talking about that Sue Montgomery was quite, instrumental in that whole thing, that she, basically aided and abetted that whole process. Certainly it seems in terms, I won't say certainly because again I can't absolutely prove it, but almost certainly in terms of coming up with the whole idea in the first place of seeking an 810, seeking a restraining order, seeking a peace order that would shut down my protest in front of the church for 1 year. I'm just going to check and see if this thing's still recording. Okay, we're only 12 minutes into the monologue. We still got plenty of time here. So, getting back to that, this is back in 2007. The judge granted the restraining order. And so I respected it. I mean, I didn't respect it in the full sense of the word, but what I mean is I did not violate it. I said, okay, fine, I'll take a holiday from protesting for 1 year. And when this thing ends, I'll come back and I'll resume my protest. And I had a quite enjoyable holiday from protesting, quite frankly. It was getting to be a bit of a chore. So basically this 1 year respite from protesting that I had no choice in was actually a nice relaxing break that I can say, well, I had no choice in the matter. So I actually did have a holiday. I did have a vacation. And I came back very refreshed and ready to go for another decade. Or more, because it's now 2019, you might have noticed. We're talking about 2007, 2008, when the restraining order was in effect. So it's been more than a decade that I've resumed my protest outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal. We shall, how can we put it, this is not a prepared statement. I don't have a teleprompter, so sometimes I might lose my train of thought a little bit. But what it comes down to is that what I did want to say is that in the mind of Reverend Diane Roller, in the mind of pretty well everyone else who signed depositions to the police, in the mind of, I suspect, many other Montreal Unitarians, this restraining order was going to be permanent. They believed that that was it, like I was finished, like I would not be able to resume my protest after a year. They believed that they'd be able to get extensions to that restraining order, and they certainly did try. And here's the interesting thing, that one thing I'd like to mention, because I think it's important. As I said, it was Reverend Diane Olenek Roller who was the front person for this. She was the only witness. She was the one who basically filed a complaint and made all of the testimony in court and so on, claiming to be very frightened, fearing for her personal safety, etc., etc., etc. Well, the Sunday that I returned to protest outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal after that restraining order ended, I was standing on the sidewalk near the entrance of the Unitarian Church of Montreal doing my protest. I'm circulating, but there are times when I'm close to the entrance of the church when Reverend Diane Olenek-Rollert herself, and essentially alone, marched out of the church right up to the sidewalk within about 3 feet of me, and very authoritatively said, you have no right to be here, or basically saying, you gotta go, you can't be here. So here's the interesting thing. This is a woman who obtained a restraining order claiming to fear for her safety, claiming to be very, very afraid of me. Well, guess what? She walked within 3 feet of me alone. There were no bodyguards and so on. She didn't send someone else to talk to me. She could have sent out some husky male Unitarian to tell me I had no right to be there. No, she did it herself, right up to me, within 3 feet. If I was the kind of person who actually did use physical violence to solve problems, she was in danger, but she wasn't, because I'm not that kind of person, and she knew it. She knew it. That's why she walked to within 3 feet of me, because she knew perfectly well that she was not going to be physically attacked. So that's it. She essentially lied to the police, lied to Crown prosecutors, and lied to Judge Roland Matt, as did some of the other people who signed depositions, as far as I'm concerned, including Sue Montgomery. Sue Montgomery has never shown any fear of me. She's shown some psychological distress as a result of the accusations I'm making about her complicity in Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse cover-up efforts, indeed her knowing and willful active participation in Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse cover-up efforts. But I would say that that emotional distress is a result of her guilty conscience. She knows perfectly well she's helping the Unitarian Universalist religious community keep clergy abuse hidden from the public. If nothing else, she helped shut down my protest outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal for 1 full year by claiming to be